Father, we just thank you for all that's taken place already tonight. We thank you for the praise that we've been able to share together as your people. And Lord, as we come to think about this whole area of leadership, we just pray that you would fill Alan afresh and use him mightily just to speak into our hearts. Lord, we know our own weaknesses, we know our own failings, but we thank you that we serve the true leader, Jesus Christ, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the one who has no failings. And we just pray that we might learn from him tonight, and that you would just shape us and mold us and make us into the servants of God that you want us to be for your glory. For we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, thanks Gareth. Thank you all for coming. My wife is obviously a lot more popular than I am, and I'm sure we'll sort that out in the car on the way back. But no, as Gareth said, obviously the subject of mental health is a huge subject, a huge concern, and there's a great interest there. So they'll be blessed tonight listening to her. But thank you for coming along. It's good to see good representation of folk here. This obviously was a bit of an experiment, and I want to thank the committee of the Bible Week for taking the risk of doing this. It was my suggestion. I think in previous years there's been a breakfast on a Thursday morning or a Saturday, and I just had the idea that if we added the extra seminar, stuck it in the middle of the week, it probably means there's an option then for everybody to get something extra. So it's good that you've come along. If we had the whole evening or a half a day or something like that, we'd have time maybe to get a little bit more of a sense of where you're leading. I would think some of you are obviously in what I would call vocational Christian ministry as ministers or pastors. Some of you are probably elders. Some of you are leading in other spheres, in the business world, maybe in education, and others of you are probably just interested in the subject of leadership. And also, we're all getting a little bit older, and I can see there's a few grey heads, which maybe means there are some of you, and you're looking back on maybe quite a number of years of leadership. So probably quite a mix in the room. And I want to talk under this theme of the crucible of leadership. I'm maybe going to need somebody to sit in that seat, and maybe Tom, if you wouldn't mind, you need to control that. Gareth, would you maybe, or somebody just maybe nudge it on when I at different points, if that's okay. I don't have a remote for it. But we're going to be thinking under this heading of the Crucible of Leadership. It's the title of a book which I wrote over the past couple of years and was published just about 9 months ago. And it sort of frames a number of themes to do with leadership within the story of Moses. Just by way of introducing this a little bit and saying what we're going to try to do tonight, the material I want to try to cover, ideally we would have a bit more time, and ideally with a bit more time I would give you space to do some reflection as we go along. I've worked through this material before with other groups where we've had a bit more time, and there's a chance then for people to reflect. So I will give you reflective questions at the end of each little bit of what I'm going to talk about, and hopefully, if you've got a piece of paper or on your phone or your iPad or whatever it is, and you want to make a note of them and take them away, you can think about them. Even better, you can buy a copy of the book, and that'll let you reflect even more deeply on it. I was involved in church leadership for just over 20 years as a pastor. For 17 of those years, I was a pastor of a international church in Switzerland, sort of halfway between Geneva and Lausanne, on the shore of Lake Geneva. I know it sounds like a terrible place to live, but really not. It's a wonderful place to live, and we lived there 17 years. Our 2 daughters grew up there, and that was a wonderful environment for me to learn lots of stuff about leadership, usually about things that I got wrong, mistakes that I made. It was a bit of a learning curve. Came back to Northern Ireland and worked for 4 years as pastor in Port Stewart Baptist Church, and then went on from there and did some postgraduate study where I began to focus on looking at aspects of leadership, and I was particularly interested in what is it that shapes leaders to become the people that they are. And I think for us as Christians it's important for us to think about that. Hopefully, if you've been leading for a while, in whatever sphere you're leading, hopefully you don't lead in the same way and you're not the same person that you were when you started out on that, whatever your sphere of leadership may be. So I was quite interested in that. And I settled, in terms of a research project. You want to flick to the next slide, Gareth, please? In terms of my research, I settled on this image of a crucible. Crucible experiences. Obviously, literally, a crucible is a container in which you can take metals or other substances, heat them up to a very high temperature. It's come metaphorically to speak of a severe test, or a place where different things get mixed in together to produce something new and exciting. And all of those ideas came together in a book called Geeks and Geezers. It was originally called Geeks and Geezers. The publishers eventually changed the title of it, which was disappointing. But it was written by a couple of American leadership scholars in California. They set out, actually, you can see Geeks and Geezers, how era, values and defining moments shape leaders. They were interested to see if the period of time in which leaders were born and grew up and became leaders, if the era in which they lived made any difference to the kind of leadership that they gave. And so they had two groups of people that they interviewed. One group was called Geezers. These were older people. These are people who largely come of age after the Second World War. The Geeks were effectively their grandchildren's generation, so a generation apart. And they interviewed a bunch of people from each of these two groups, found that there were certain differences, which were quite interesting. But one of the things that they found was that everybody they interviewed, whether they were old geezers or young geeks, everybody they interviewed talked about some kind of transformative experience that they had had. And they put the label Crucible on that. They called it an intense transformational experience, a place where essential questions are asked. So I thought it would be really interesting to try to see what are the crucible experiences that Christian leaders encounter. What's the nature of those? What do they look like? And in what way do they shape who those leaders become? And that's what I did for my doctoral work, explored that. I've gone on, been interested in the story of how leaders are shaped. Obviously my book has been written. I also have a podcast that comes out from time to time called the Leadership Journey Podcast, where I interview Christian leaders and talk about their stories. But one of the things that I've come to see is that while you may have a number of crucible experiences that you can think about in your own life and your own development as a leader, leadership itself, it seems to me, is a crucible. So this statement here, insofar as a leader is shaped in the process of leading, leadership itself is a crucible. In other words, and this is important I think for us to hear, it's one of the important things I want to say tonight, leadership is not just something you do, but it is also the arena in which you are formed. You know, those of you who are involved actively in leadership, part of the hope that you have as a leader is that you're going to shape the organization or the church or the group or the school, whatever it might be, the circumstances in which you lead. You want to shape that. But the reality is that not only will you shape that, but it will also shape you. And the process of leading will shape you. The things you experience will shape you. And in that sense, leadership itself is a crucible. When I came then to write my book a couple of years ago, and I didn't write it because of COVID, but COVID certainly, with all of the changes of work arrangements, gave me a bit more time to sit down and write it. I focused it around the story of Moses. I've been fascinated with the story of Moses for quite a long time. There's a quote here from Ruth Haley Barton, who's also written a book about Moses, and I resonate very much with what she said. She said, "I've been drawn to the story of Moses because I found it to be so complete in illustrating the different aspects of leadership and so unflinchingly honest about the challenges leaders experience." Now, we could say a lot about the Bible and leadership and how do you come to Scripture to try to learn things about leadership. It'll be a whole seminar of its own, really. But I think we realize that one of the ways that Scripture teaches us about leadership is its portrayal of leaders, both good ones and bad ones. And most of them in reality are mixed, aren't they? But we realize that there are some leaders whose stories are told really with a very small amount of detail. And there are others, maybe particularly like Moses or David or Paul, the Lord Jesus himself. And there's a huge amount of narrative that's given. There's a lot of riches for us to mine. And I think that's part of what Ruth Haley Barton is saying here. There's so many aspects of leadership that are illustrated in the story of Moses. And it is so, and the account is so honest about the challenge that leaders experience. You maybe have heard this quote, this next thing, from D.L. Moody. I don't know where I first heard it quite a long time ago, and I thought, that really sums him up. It's kind of quaint and homely, but it really sums up the story in lots of ways. Moody allegedly said this: Moses spent 40 years thinking he was somebody, 40 years he was learning he was nobody, and 40 years discovering what God can do with a nobody. When you think about it, if you're familiar with the story of Moses, you can see how much that resonates actually with the description in Scripture. It's Stephen in his sermon in Acts, when he talks about the history of Israel. It's Stephen who gives us this framework of the 3 periods of 40 years in Moses' life. And to maybe get away from some of the more kind of folksy language of Moody, if we go to the next slide, Moses, the 3 phases of his life, 3 40s. First of all was the formative stage of his life. That's the stage of life where he's growing up in Egypt. He's got the privileges of an Egyptian upbringing, and not just any Egyptian upbringing, but Egyptian royalty. The middle phase of his life is the phase where he spends it in exile. We've been thinking about exiles this week. Exile, wilderness, those kinds of experiences, where Moses goes from this place of great privilege in the first part of his life to spending the next 40 years of his life effectively in obscurity. Much of Midian was desert, and we know very little in terms of the events of those 40 years. We know he got married, we know that he had a couple of sons, we know that he looked after his father-in-law's sheep. But it was largely a season of obscurity. 40 years that he spent there where not a lot seemed to be happening. And it was only then that he goes into the final 40 years of his life, which is the active season of his leadership, where he spends those 40 years in leadership of this group of people, the Hebrews. Now that in itself, even just that breakdown, if we go to the next slide, that in itself, I think, raises a question for each of us. You may want to just pause for a moment. You may want to write something down. You may just want to make a mental note of this. But here's the question. The question is, which of these things best describes where you would say you are on your leadership journey? And how's it going? So some of you, maybe who are younger, maybe find yourselves at a formative stage in a leadership journey. The emphasis is very much on the learning. It's very much on the preparation at this stage. Some of you maybe find yourselves in the exile phase, the obscurity phase. I think it happens to leaders. Leadership is not always this sort of wave of excitement and lots of things happening and lots of significance. I think many of us who have led have found ourselves at times thinking to ourselves, well, is that it? Am I finished? Am I now on the shelf? And that can be a very difficult experience, but it's one that I think lots of leaders go through. So if you're in an exile stage, how are you coping with that? And then if you feel, well, I'm in the active phase. I've had a season of preparation, maybe been through this desert experience, but I would say largely what I'm doing now is I'm quite fulfilled because this is quite an active stage. So what are you doing? How's that going? Now, I would say this about those phases. I think that we can expect to have those things happening in our lives. Unlike Moses, I would say that our experiences are not necessarily linear. That you do all the formative stuff, and then you have a wilderness time, and then you have an active time. You maybe do a bit of formative stuff, and then you have an active time, and then suddenly you find yourself in the wilderness. And then a bit more active, and then you realize you need to have a bit more formative experience. It's almost more cyclical, and any of these 3 things could be happening at different times. And it's not that you come out of one and you say, right, I've got the badge for that, I'm not going to need to do that again. These things are they're probably always repeating along the way. So that's one reflection. I noticed one person taking a screenshot there, which is a good idea actually. If you want to make sure you can take some of this stuff away with you. You will buy the book as well, though, of course, because don't just base it on screenshots. So thinking about Moses then, and the question is, how does his story inform us about what we need to pay attention to along the course of our own leadership journey? Now, I meant to say at the beginning, a leadership seminar, there is so much to talk about in relation to leadership. And if you thought that maybe I was going to talk about how do you set vision, or how do you communicate, or how do you resolve conflict, or how do you bring about change and manage change and all that kind of stuff, I need to apologize because I'm going to disappoint you. I'm not really going to talk about that tonight. We're going to talk more about what you're going to learn as a leader along the course of your journey. I think the best kind of leadership emerges from who the leader is. And so if we pay attention to the formative experiences and the formative learnings, and those things shape us, I think we will lead better as we learn, and we become more godly people, we become better people, and we lead out of that, and I think our leadership will be better. So I want to highlight a number of lessons that I think we can draw from the story of Moses. This really forms the framework of the book. So I'll be touching on themes that I develop probably a little more length. Number one, you need to learn that you don't get there by yourself. So if you have a Bible with you, if you can go over to Exodus chapter 2, Exodus chapter 2, and the opening verses of the chapter. Now, most of you are probably familiar with the story. This fledgling nation of Israel finds itself in Egypt. It's all come about off the tail end of the story of Joseph, and how his family went down to Egypt to be protected from famine. And generations go by, and eventually the memory of Joseph fades. And the Hebrews who are now living in Egypt become a threat. They're useful, but they're also a threat. They're useful because they can do lots of manual work, but they become a threat because there are a lot of them, and Pharaoh gets worried, and so there's this whole scheme of trying to get rid of the Hebrew baby boys, and that would be his way of stifling the development of the Hebrew people. And that introduces us then, and that takes us into chapter 2, where the text says, now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. This is Moses. Where is Moses in the birth order of his family? You can answer.
Third.
What would you think if you didn't know the rest of the story, and you just read this? What would you think? He's first. It's interesting, isn't it? It's really quite striking. And there are various theories around this. Talk a little bit about it in the book. You have to buy the book to find out what some of those are. Some interesting Jewish ideas around this. But I think one of the things that may simply be going on here is that we're being prepared here for a new beginning. Yeah, there's Moses and there's Aaron and Miriam, and they'll have a part to play later on. But the writer here wants to cut right to the chase and say, let's get to the story of Moses, because with the birth of Moses, there's a new beginning for these people. But it's striking the way the story is told. And he's born at what I would say was the worst of times, in the sense that, if you could choose when to be born and where to be born, you would not have chosen to be born as a Hebrew in Egypt at this particular time. Certainly not as a Hebrew boy. It was a terrible set of circumstances to be born into. But he was born into a family of faith. And it was because he was born into a family of faith that his mother, his parents, his father's associated with this as well. When the New Testament talks about it, it's because of their faith that they decide to defy the decree of the king, and rather than allow Moses to be tossed into the river, they hide him and protect him. And of course, as the story goes on, eventually he has to be put in this little basket, placed in the river. His sister, so she's already there, she's old enough to be looking after him, she's watching out. Pharaoh's daughter comes down, And in what I think is a delicious irony, you've got the daughter of Pharaoh who ends up protecting this little boy who Pharaoh wanted dead, and who actually is going to be, he's going to become the nemesis of Pharaoh eventually, because he's going to become the leader of the Hebrews. Now here's a really simple point here. Had it not been for the faith of Moses' mother, for the compassion of Pharaoh's daughter, and for the ingenuity of Moses' sister, humanly speaking, Moses would not have made it. It's interesting, by the way, that they're all women. And I think it's fascinating that Pharaoh reckoned in order to deal with the Hebrews, he would deal with the males, kill the males. And it's almost as if God says, well, deal with the males if you want, but I'm actually going to use the women. And God uses the women to protect Moses. But my main point here is that were it not for those three women, Moses' life would have been lost. And the extension of that is to say that whoever you are, whatever you do, you would not be where you are today were it not for people who maybe made courageous decisions when you were a child, or who helped to nurture your faith, who talked to you about the Lord, who gave you an opportunity to get involved in some kind of leadership or in some kind of ministry. You know, none of us would be where we are if it were not for the influence of other people in us and for us. There's a fellow that I know. He's not a close friend, but someone I know. His name is Dave Burke, and Dave's a retired pastor of a free church up in the north of England. And he told me one time, I was interviewing for my podcast, and he told me about an experience where a number of years ago, when he was in ministry, he decided to go on a retreat. And he decided he would take himself off to an Anglican retreat centre somewhere in the north of England. So he went off to this place, checked himself into this Anglican retreat centre, and he discovered that on the property was a maze. Now, I would say probably very few of us have ever experienced a maze as a spiritual practice. There's a whole story about that. And certainly Dave, when he saw it, he said, "What on earth is this?" The idea is that you walk through the maze. It's different from no, it was a labyrinth. Beg your pardon, it's not a maze, it's a labyrinth. There's a difference between a maze and a labyrinth. A maze is where you get lost, and a labyrinth is where you're meant to find your way to the middle. So it was a labyrinth. And he decided he would walk it, didn't know what it was for, he decided he would walk it. And he decided that as he would walk it, he would stop every couple of minutes and he would recall one person who had influenced his life up to that point. And so he walked very slowly through this labyrinth and came up with about 30 names of people without whom he would not have been the person that he was. So, you know, I say if we had more time, and I just want to be careful about the time. If we had more time, I would get you to stop at this point and make a list of 5 people who have helped to shape you. Now, you don't need to do it now, but it's something you can take away from tonight, and you can say, "Do you know, I'm going to do that. I'm going to think about that." And I would say, as you begin the exercise and write them down, as you begin that exercise, I would say you begin to come up. You'll fairly quickly come up with quite a lot of people, and you'll realize with gratitude that it was because of the influence of those people that contributed to you becoming the person you are today. So that's a good starting point for us. We need to realize that we don't get where we get to by ourselves. Second thing, we need to learn to navigate deserts. Now, I've already talked a little bit about this, and this is the middle years of Moses' life, and where Moses spends these 40 years in obscurity in Midian. And I've already said that for many people who find themselves in leadership, there are seasons. Sometimes they're maybe relatively short seasons. Sometimes they're longer seasons where we find that we no longer have the opportunity to do the significant work that we believe that we've been called to. I had a conversation yesterday with a guy. It was again from my podcast. It's an episode that'll hopefully come out at the weekend. A Dutch guy, and as a young man, young Christian, he'd come to Ireland to work in a mission team way down on the south coast, and frankly it didn't work out, and he had to go back to Holland after about four or 5 years. And that's a painful experience, because you think, well, what happened to the call of God in that? And sometimes it happens. Sometimes it's a health issue. Sometimes something else goes wrong, and we find ourselves sidelined, and we wonder, well, what's the purpose of all of that? It's like Moses and those 40 years of obscurity. And there's a great quote from an author called Dan Allender in a book called Leading with a Limp. And I love this quote from Dan Allender. I think it's profound. He said, before Moses led a nation, he wandered in Midian for 40 years and tended sheep. Our days spent in the desert may be shorter, but they will be no less agonizing, because they're a season of death. A leader's dreams must die if a deep soul is to be born. Idealism may get us into the fray, but it's the loss of all that we cherish that begins to form in us a heart capable of leading others reluctantly and humbly. It's counterintuitive, that, isn't it? Because there's something, there's a kind of wisdom that we pick up about leadership, or a supposed wisdom that we pick up about leadership is, well, if you've got this great dream, get out there and proclaim your dream, and everybody will follow you, and the momentum will carry you, and it's going to be absolutely fantastic. And Allender is saying that actually our own dreams need to die. And it's only when that happens that a deep soul is born. And that's what we lead out. That's what we lead out of, in perhaps a reluctant way, and a humble way, but in a way that will have an extra depth and that will carry us further. It's a profound point. It's a painful point, but I think it's quite profound. Moses' desert experience. I think there are a number of things that mark it. Unanticipated circumstances. He didn't really expect to be where he was in Midian for 40 years. Remember, what got him into Midian was killing the Egyptian. And then instead of the Hebrews thinking, oh, isn't this wonderful? We've got this man who's come to be our deliverer. They say, well, who made you a judge and a ruler over us? And so almost from one day to the next, he goes from thinking, well, God's got me here to be the leader of these people. And the next day it's, well, here he is. He's sitting beside a well in Midian, on the run from Pharaoh. The circumstances not at all what he was expecting. Abandoned dreams. I think I've often tried to compare the 40-year-old Moses and the 80-year-old Moses. 40-year-old Moses had the dream of being a freedom fighter. 80-year-old Moses is saying, God, just leave me alone. Let me wander about in the desert here. I don't want, he's basically offered his dream job when he's 80, but he doesn't want it now. His dreams have been abandoned. It's a place of unexpected allies. Gets married, has a wife. He has a wonderful father-in-law. I'd love to have more time to talk about Jethro. I think Jethro's a wonderful character. He's an inspiring character, Moses' father-in-law. He becomes an unexpected ally for Moses. It's a place of honest realization. It's something that I've thought as well. We're told one detail about his son, his first son. First son's called Gershom, which sounds like a Hebrew word for a foreigner. And when Moses gave his son the name Gershom, he named him that way because Moses said, well, I've become a foreigner in a foreign land. You see that in chapter 2 of Exodus down in verse 22. I've become a foreigner in a foreign land. It's an honest realization of, here I am in a place where I don't belong. Now let me say this, I think sometimes, as Christians generally, and Pauline will probably help to shatter a few of the taboos over in the other room, but I maybe need to shatter some in here as well. I think sometimes as Christians we're not very good at naming reality. I remember having a conversation with bumped into a guy in a Christian bookshop a number of years ago. Don't worry, it wasn't you, Robin, and it wasn't your shop. But bumped into this guy. It was somebody that Pauline was with me, and somebody that we knew. And he was involved in ministry, and he talked to us for a little while, and from most of what he said, it wasn't going very well. He was quite discouraged, felt unappreciated or underappreciated. And yet, weirdly, he punctuated his comments with a little phrase. He said, "It's all good." And to this day I can't really work out what that was. Was he saying that because, well, he felt that he needed to say that it was all good because God is good all the time? Did he say it because he wanted us to think he was happier than he actually was? Did he say it because he just thought that's how you're meant to present yourself if you're in ministry? Sometimes we're not very good at the honest realization of where we are and the honest admission of where we are when we are in a desert place. The fifth thing about it, and the final thing, the most encouraging thing about it, is that it becomes a place of transforming encounter, because that's where he meets God. So there's a question for reflection around this as well. And again, we don't have really time for this, but a quote from a Jewish scholar called Erica Brown, who says, "What matters most can only truly be discovered where there are a few distractions." That's the desert. Because sometimes you go into the desert, you don't want to go into the desert. You're kind of forced out there. Sometimes, like Jesus, Jesus gets up to go out early in the morning to go to a deserted place because it's quiet. There are a few distractions. Going to pray. But what matters most can only truly be discovered where there are a few distractions. And those of you familiar with some of what's taught in the early chapters of Deuteronomy about the wandering of Israel in the desert, you'll know that God brings them into the desert to see what's in their hearts. And so there's a question then, how and when have you found it to be true? Maybe in the desert place is the place where you discover what matters most. Third one, and I'm trying to keep an eye on the time as well, because I do want to give you some time for questions. So I'll probably have to speed up a little. You really are going to have to buy the book, because you're just going to miss so much of the detail. The next one is that leaders need to learn to get past their excuses. And this is the call episode, the commissioning episode in chapter 3 and chapter 4. And it is remarkable because you've got Moses, who at one point says, "I'm slow of speech, I'm not really much of a talker." And yet he has this toe-to-toe debate with God, who's calling him to do something, and no matter what God says, Moses is pushing back against it. He doesn't seem to have any problem talking then. I've summed up his excuses in these 5 questions. Who am I? And sometimes that's a very appropriate thing to say when God asks you to do something. Who am I that you would ask me to do this? I feel inadequate for it. Who are you? That's when God says, I am who I am. I will be who I will be. What about them? The memory that he has of previous rejection and saying, it's like, I went to those people before and they rejected me. I'm pretty sure that if I go now, they may reject me again. Those of you who are in church leadership, by the way, have you heard this? You come up with this idea, an initiative, a ministry initiative, and people say, "Oh, we tried that once before and it didn't work." That's why it's good that tonight seems to have worked, Tom. I guess you can try it again. You know what the mirror image of that is? We tried that before and it didn't work. Oh no, we've never done that before. And either way, you don't do it. You're sort of stuck. You're stuck either way with it. But I feel a little bit of sympathy for Moses, because the scar of the previous rejection, and now he's going to have to go back to the people who rejected him, or at least to their children. Going to have to go back to those people. Why should it go any different this time? And then what about this? His speech impediment. I think he had a stammer. That's what scholars reckon. He had a stammer, and that was going to make it very difficult for him. It was an excuse. But eventually, when God answers all of his objections, Moses basically says, "Oh, just get someone else to do it." And God doesn't let him off the hook. He does give him Aaron, but he doesn't let him off the hook. And I think then, to go to a reflective question on that, as you think about yourself, and again, I don't know all of you in the room. I don't know many of you really in the room at all, so I don't know your circumstances. But it's not impossible that there's some of you in the room and you've got a sense that God is leading you into something, but you're pushing back. And you've got excuses. Maybe they're not exactly the same ones that Moses had, but maybe there are some excuses. And here's the question: is, as you think about your own sense of calling, whatever stage you're at in it, has leadership always been something comfortable for you, or are you a reluctant leader? It's not a bad thing to be a reluctant leader, by the way. As long as it doesn't stop you doing what you're supposed to do. There's some value in reluctant leaders. But it's maybe worth thinking to yourself again, Am I, quick to put my hand up and say I'll do that? Am I one of those people who just jumps in where there's a gap, or am I more of a reluctant leader? Why am I a reluctant leader? And does that ever get in the way, maybe, of what I should be doing? Getting over our excuses. Number 4, learning to share the load. And there are a couple of particular incidents here. One in Exodus 18, which involves Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, and one in Numbers 11. And both of them have to do with Moses being overwhelmed by the amount of work that he has. And Jethro, first of all, in Exodus 18, he sees it in a way that Moses himself doesn't see it, and he gives him advice. The other incident in Numbers 11, it's actually worth going across to Numbers 11. It's one of my favourite stories from the whole of the ministry of Moses. This is where Moses is at a point where he cannot do any more. He's had to put up with lots of criticism, complaining, all of this kind of stuff that's going on. He knows that the Lord is becoming angry at the grumbling of the people. And so Numbers 11, verse 11, he asked the Lord, "Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? What have I done to displease you that you put the burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth? Why do you tell me to carry them in my arms as a nurse carries an infant to the land that you promised on oath to their ancestors?" And so on and so on. And he says, "I cannot carry all these people by myself. The burden is too heavy for me. If this is how you're going to treat me, please go ahead and kill me if I find favour in your eyes, and do not let me face my own ruin." That's very strong language, isn't it? Now, you may never have used language like that, but if I use the expression burnout, or that you talk about the term burnout, I think a lot of us know what that's like, don't we? A lot of us have maybe experienced it or come close to it, or we know people who have. We've maybe those in ministry have colleagues who are been off work for 6 months for burnout. Some of you may have been off. I have been off work with burnout. It happens. It's one of the occupational hazards that comes with many responsibilities, not just church ministry, but it does come with church ministry. And it's in that setting that God does this remarkable thing where he gets Moses to gather 70 of the elders and takes some of the spirit from Moses and puts the spirit on the 70 elders, and they prophesy. And there's a really fascinating thing that happens. There are 2 guys, one's called Eldad, one's called Medad, and they have not come out to meet with the other 70 and with Moses. But lo and behold, they're prophesying in the camp. And Joshua, somebody comes running out and says, "Oh, the Eldad and Medad, they're still in the camp and they're prophesying. Spirits come upon them as well." And Joshua has this reaction. And he says, "Moses, my Lord, stop them." And Moses says, "Are you jealous on my account?" And I think that's just fascinating. It's a little bit like the disciples. "Lord, we saw somebody casting out demons in your name. And he's not one of us. Should we stop him?" Jesus said, "He's not against us, he's for us." And here's Joshua, I think in his immaturity, but also his loyalty to Moses. He sees these people as a threat to Moses because somehow they've got their ministry directly from God, whereas the other guys, they've all got their ministry from Moses in some sense. And these are like an independent prophetic ministry that's going on. And Moses' answer is just amazing. He says, "I wish that all the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Lord would put his spirit on them." Now, folks, especially in Christian leadership, I think if you can get to that point, that's a wonderful place of maturity. To see the blessing fall on the church that's down the road, and maybe to see the blessing land on a group of people who don't cross their T's and dot their I's in exactly the same place that you do. And you can say, "Do you know what? I wish that all the Lord's people were prophets." We learn, there are loads of things we need to learn about sharing ministry. But one of them has to be, we've got to realize that ministry and leadership cannot be about me and me promoting myself and me promoting my group. It has to be, I just want God to work. I just want these people to be blessed. I just want the best outcomes for as many people as possible. And that can have lots of ramifications. And so the question then is, how easy do you find it to share responsibility with others? You know, some of you maybe need to look back at Exodus chapter 18 and that bottleneck passage. You know, somebody once said that the thing with bottlenecks is that they're usually at the top. You know, you think organizationally, I think it's also true, isn't it? That the bottleneck is sometimes is often at the top. How easy do we find it to share responsibility with others? Number 5. I'll go through these. I'll take a little bit of time on this, and then I'll just mention the others because I do want to throw it open for a bit of questions. Learn to find your identity in the love of God. Back to Exodus 33. Exodus 33. This is a whole dilemma that Moses is having. It seems the Lord is not going to go with them, not directly. And Moses says to him, if your presence doesn't go with us, don't send us up. How will anyone know that you're pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth? And the Lord said to Moses, I will do the very thing you have asked, because I am pleased with you and I know you by name. The ESV translates it slightly differently. It's, you have found favour in my sight and I know you by name. And you think Moses experienced so many amazing things in his leadership journey, in his ministry that he had. So many amazing things. And I wonder, as he reflected on it, how he would have ranked this experience of God saying this to him. And I think it's very important for us, because you know we all look for our identity somewhere, don't we? And as leaders, I think sometimes we look for our identity in our leadership. As church leaders, sometimes we look for our identity in the success of our ministry. And here's Moses receiving this from God. I'm pleased with you and I know you by name. One of the things that I have noticed as I have talked with quite a number of leaders over the past few years is, from time to time, not everybody talks like this, but from time to time, someone will tell me a story about an experience, and sometimes the experience is, you know, you think, wow, that's unusual. But they'll tell me a story about how God seems to have gone out of his way to reassure them of his personal love. And it struck me, and I think, and there are plenty of people who've written about this as well, and written more eloquently than me. Plenty of people have written about this. But I think it's a sign of just how foundational it is for us in leadership to have that relationship with God, to know that he loves us and that is our identity. So I'm going to pick on Gareth here for a moment. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to do anything. So Gareth gets up on a Sunday and he preaches at Cookstown Baptist, and it's amazing. It's really wonderful. And there's a couple of people get converted, and there's a young person comes at the end and says, you know, thank you for what you shared today. Really helped me make a big decision. And you know, everybody's just thinking that was the most amazing bit of preaching that we've ever heard. And Gareth goes home and has his lunch and he's just feeling amazing. And then the next week Gareth gets up and he preaches, and for some reason, you know, not sure whether it's something he ate the night before, but for some reason it just feels like the whole thing just doesn't get more than 3 feet above the ground, really, you know. And he goes home to have his dinner and he's thinking to himself, I think I might as well pack this all in, you know. There's no point in me trying to do this. I think as preachers we've all been there, right? You know, those of us who preach, we've all been there. But you know what? The love that God has for Gareth doesn't change depending on whether he's had an amazing Sunday or whether he's had a Sunday that just he sort of feels, could the ground just not swallow up here and get me out of here? And I think that's where we need to find our identity. And so here's a quote. I hope you don't mind. It's Henry Nouwen. Henry Nouwen was a Catholic. Had some amazing things to say about the love of God. I hope you don't mind me quoting him here. You can, you know, eat the meat, spit out the bones if you need to do that. He says, you are not what you do, although you do a lot. You are not what you've collected in terms of friendships and connections, although you might have many. You're not the popularity that you've received, You're not the success of your work. You're not what people say about you, whether they speak well or whether they speak poorly about you. All these things that keep you quite busy, quite occupied, and often quite preoccupied are not telling the truth about who you are. I'm here to remind you in the name of God that you are the beloved daughters and sons of God, and that God says to you, I have called you from all eternity, and you're engraved from all eternity in the palms of my hands. You're mine, you belong to me, and I love you with an everlasting love. That's where we need to lead from, folks. Because then on the good days we come back to that because it's still true. On the bad days we come back to that because it's still true. We lead from that. We do not lead in order to win the approval of other people, because we're learning to lean into this. I think it's probably a lifelong journey. The sooner you get started on it, I think the better. But leaders learn to find their identity in the love of God. Very quickly, number 6. Let me just skip through a few. Sorry, Gareth. We need to learn how to handle conflict and criticism. It just comes with it, you know. Church leadership, any kind of leadership, you're just going to get it. If leaders, very often, I think part of the job description should say lightning rod. You know, that's just part of it. If there's discontent and trouble around, you know, you're going to be the one who gets zapped by it. That's just how it's going to be. If you try to lead in a way that avoids any kind of conflict, or any kind of complaining or any kind of criticism, well, even that's not going to work, because there's going to be people who are going to say, never does anything, you know, he just sits on the fence the whole time. You get criticised for that as well. So you're going to have to learn how to handle criticism and conflict. And there are lots of things to say about that. One of those is to say that some critique is necessary for growth. You can't grow without being criticised. The only way you can grow the only way you can get by without ever having critique is if you're already perfect and you don't need to grow, and none of us is there. So it means inevitably there are going to be things that people are going to say from time to time that is going to give you an area where you need to grow, and you need to learn to take that. The fourth one of that, I wish I had time to talk about the rest of them, but the fourth one of that, leadership is a sacred trust. It's not all about you. So if there's criticism, you know, don't make it all about you. Sometimes it's not about you. Sometimes it's about something else. But I think sometimes we've got a tendency to make it about ourselves. Number 7, learn that you're not the finished article. I'm thinking here of Moses and where he, towards the end of his leadership, he strikes the rock in the book of Numbers. He's told to speak to the rock, but he strikes the rock. And I think what happens there is a re-emergence of Moses' anger. There's evidence that Moses was an angry young man. That's why he killed the Egyptian. That's why he smashed the stone tablets. There was anger there. And for much of the time, he becomes more meek. That expression is used of him. But in those circumstances, there's provocation, and he snaps. And I think it's a very simple reminder to us in leadership that our character is a work in progress. And we must never assume that we've made it and that we've got there and we've no more growth, we've reached some sort of stage of perfection. We want to finish well. Moses did not finish well. Moses fell short, and we need to do what we can in order to finish well. The final thing, number 8, learn to prepare the next generation. And you know, I'm looking around at people who are probably even a little bit older than me in the room, and I think it's good for us to cover this point here. Numbers 27, 16, 17. This is Moses' prayer as he comes to the end of his ministry. He says, "May the Lord, the God who gives breath to all living things, appoint someone over this community to go out and come in before them, one who will lead them out and bring them in, so the Lord's people will not be like sheep without a shepherd." For all that I've said that Moses falls short at the end and doesn't finish well, I think this is a sense in which, strangely, he does actually finish well. Because instead of finishing in a huff and saying, well, if I'm not going to get to bring these people into the promised land, if I'm not going to be able to go into the promised land, well, you know, forget it. Somebody else can take care of it. I don't care about these. Moses' concern for God's people went beyond the time frame of Moses' ministry and Moses' leadership. That's a genuine heart concern that he had. And I think whatever your leadership role, you know this, you maybe don't live with the reality of it, but you need to live with the reality of it. It is only ever a temporary assignment. And I turned 64 the other day. I find it very hard to believe. I'm thinking of asking for a recount. But there are some of you that are around that age, some of you are a bit older. And it just whizzes by, doesn't it? And those of you who are younger, you think, oh, there's another old guy, just tell us how quickly life goes by. You're thinking like that, but it does. It whizzes by. And suddenly we find ourselves in a place where, we're not going to be leading forever, and we realize we're not going to be leading forever. And I think particularly in the second half of whatever leadership role that you're in, you need to be investing more and more of hopefully your accumulated wisdom into the next generation. And what's remarkable about Moses' prayer here is that the answer to Moses' prayer was right in front of him. There's a guy called Joshua. And if you take time to read through the narrative and look at the incidents where Joshua and Moses are in stories together, you realize that Joshua has been exposed to a whole range of experiences with Moses, so that when Moses is ready to step away from his leadership role, Joshua is ready to step into it. And the whole thing of, as I was with Moses, I will be with you, makes a huge amount of sense, because Joshua has seen exactly how the Lord has been with Moses. And as he steps out, he's not going to step into the same, to doing the same things that Moses did. It's a different phase, it's a different time, it's a different task. But the continuity is in the fact that the same God who is with Moses will now be with Joshua. So we need to be thinking about that. We need to be preparing the next generation. So that's a very, very quick run through. I think each of these lessons is profound. There's a lot more to say about them. And obviously, I think there are things that we learn. We're constantly in the process of learning these things as we go. Those of you who are older, I hope that having listened and begun to think about some of these things, you can look back and say, all right, okay, I can maybe start to trace some of what's been going on during my own leadership journey. And those of you who are younger, I hope what this does in some way is sketch out a little bit of a roadmap and say, as you embark on a leadership journey, here are some of the kinds of things that you can expect to be challenged with, and you can expect to face and have to learn as you go along. Okay, I've talked enough. We've got maybe 10 minutes, Tom? Yeah, 10 minutes. The folks who are in the church had the advantage of sitting in comfortable seats. You have the advantage of being at the top of the coffee queue. Any questions or comments around any of that? So either it was very clear or else very confusing.
A sort of comment or question, would you agree that it's easier to handle critique if in the course of your leadership journey you've had a wife or a friend who's actually spoken into your life and given you constructive criticism?
Yes.
In other words, you sort of learn that, if you like, and then you learn how to deal with the other. Is that reality or is that imagination?
I think that I hadn't thought of it like that, but I think you're right, and I think there's great value in having trusted people around you. I think when I think back to times when I was a young pastor, I was very fearful of critique, because I was very insecure. Just to be honest, I was very insecure, and so when people critiqued areas of my ministry, I found it very, very difficult to cope with. And I look back on that now, and I can say, there are people who, at the end of the day, they had my good on their heart. I just didn't see that. I felt threatened by it. So I think, Philip, what you're saying is, and probably from a relatively early stage, if we can actually surround ourselves with people whom we trust, whom we know are on our side and are not out to destroy us, and we invite critique from them, I think that maybe helps us to be able to deal with some of the other stuff. And I think in dealing with some of the other stuff as well, it's good to have those people already around you, because to deal with criticism, to receive criticism when you're isolated, it's very difficult to handle it. Whereas if you've got people around you who are allies, but who tell you the truth, if you say to them, well, so-and-so has said this to me, is there anything in it? And they say, no. Well, you believe that. But if they're genuinely concerned for us, they'll say, well, actually, we didn't want to say this to you, but there probably is a point there. So there's probably value in learning to receive critique, surrounded by a group of people. I tell a story in the book about a guy. He's a guy who's involved. I mean, some of you will know him. I'm not going to mention his name, but he's a young guy who's involved in leadership, and he asked me a question one time, and I think it was quite remarkable. The question he said, his leadership has been going really quite well, and he's well respected. And he asked me, how could he put himself in a place where he might be able to hear voices that would disagree with him, or disagree with things that he was doing. And I thought, wow, that's amazing. Because most of us, if things are going well and everybody's saying, you're doing a really good job, you think, great, thank you, that's all I need to hear. But he's saying, no. I want to hear from people who maybe don't agree with me on something, or who think I've made a wrong decision somewhere, because that's how I'm going to grow. I thought it was tremendous maturity in that. I certainly, when I was his age, I couldn't have done that. Really couldn't. Do you want to add anything to it, Philip, from your own experience?
No, I think I have a wife that gives me plenty of which helps a lot.
Yeah.
Actually. It's a reality check.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a very positive thing to have look around you, particularly if you manage to have a wife. Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Any other? Yep. Go ahead, Ivor.
Thinking about what you were saying about the next generation.
Yeah.
I remember hearing an American pastor in the PCA, Harry Reeder, and Harry Reeder would have said that pastors and ministers should always take somebody with them when they're doing pastoral work, maybe an elder or somebody, in other words, training them, the next generation. Now, I don't 100% agree with that, because I think there are occasions where you can't take somebody with you, or you're better not, because of confidentiality and whatever. It's not something that I did. Possibly I should have done more of it, but it's just the fact, it's another way of saying, look, when you are a pastor, look for ways of sort of taking young guys or whatever with you, or not sort of telling them all at the one time, of course, but so as they can know what's happening. But it's a thought. As I say, I didn't practice it the way that Harry said it, but I think there are possibilities in it for sometimes to do that.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, Ivor. Thank you for that. I think also sort of related to that, the whole area of mentoring. And I think those of us who, those of us who get a bit older, I think should be looking out for opportunities to do that. And those of you who are younger, don't be afraid to ask somebody. I think mentoring is probably in the past 20 years probably a lot more talk about mentoring than there was further back. It probably didn't really exist so much further back, but it's there, and I think we need to be thinking about that. Some people would talk as well, just in terms of aging. It's obviously my obsession at the minute, aging. But in terms of aging, there's some people talk about two kinds of intelligence. That when you're younger and you're on the sort of on the rise in terms of your skill set, there's what's called liquid intelligence, which is innovation, creativity, all that kind of stuff. And that's you have a lot of that when you're younger. But it rises and then it falls, and you maybe get about 20 years out of that. And if you keep trying to recover that as you get older, it's frustrating. But instead of that, and some people would say that what you need to lean into is what the second kind of intelligence, which is called crystallized intelligence. And that is the accumulation of experience and the accumulation of wisdom. We should be growing in wisdom. I know, there's people, you can say age is automatic, but wisdom is, that's optional. But we ought to be growing in wisdom. We ought to be, learning and being reflective and being careful as we grow older. And as we get older, there should be more. We may have less of the liquid intelligence. We're less creative, less innovative. But we should have more in terms of wisdom and experience that we can be sharing. And we shouldn't be afraid to do that. And we shouldn't be afraid to, organize ourselves to do that and share it with other people. Is that the cows coming home? It sounds like that. It sounds like Switzerland. The cows are coming down the mountains. Is there another question?
Alan, should we be leaders that serve or servants that lead?
Great question. Great question. I recommend a book on that. It's a book called Leadership or Servanthood. The author is a Malaysian Methodist called Hua Young. So it's HWA YUNG. Book published by Langham just about a year ago. Hua Young's a lovely, godly man, and has obviously a lot of ministry in the East, but is trained in the West and has observed the West. And he's written this book out of a very deep concern that in the Western church, we've become somewhat obsessed by leadership and leadership development. And he's saying, well, hang on a minute. The emphasis in Jesus' ministry was much more about discipleship and servanthood. So should we be leaders who serve or servants who lead? He would say that we all need to be servants. Some of us will find that the sphere in which we serve will be leadership. But service, I think the answer is that service and servanthood needs to be our essential posture. And some of us will be will lead from that. Hua Young says that if we don't really get the concept of servanthood into our hearts, and we go after leadership without really internalizing the concept of servanthood, then we end up with ugly ambition, and it's actually very dangerous. And I think he's right. I think he's right. Does that answer your question? What's your own thought on it? You've obviously thought about it.
I agree with you that we are servants of God, and that's got to be our starting point, and from that,
Yeah.
our leadership should come.
Yeah. It's interesting. There's the whole area of leadership. I mean, there's a tremendous fascination with leadership, both outside the church and inside the church. There's huge amounts of books and stuff. People keep writing books about leadership for some strange reason, but there's just a huge interest in it. And I've noticed that in recent years, books like that book by Hua Young that I've mentioned, another book by a guy called Arthur Bowers from North America, called Servants and Fools. There's a bit of pushback, and rightly so, because I think people are looking at and saying, well, hey, in the church we've bought into very secular models of leadership, and sometimes that's been with disastrous results. And there's a desire to get back to Scripture and to see some of the priorities of followership and of discipleship and of servanthood, and to work off that basis. I think I don't know how big it is, but there's certainly some voices that are starting to talk like this, and I think it's important that they are. Tom, we could keep going till they all come over for their tea.
You got a minute or two yet, I would think.
Okay. Yeah. Is my wife long-winded?
I'll maybe ask a question.
Yeah, please.
You can delve down into the specifics of leadership. I hope you don't mind me maybe delving down into one of them channels. In a generation maybe that we've started to see our pastors and ministers go off with increased stress, or more going off with stress. How we as a church on a local level, not on a institutional sort of association level, help cope with that as a local church? How can we help and support to reduce them numbers?
Great question. What's your name?
Timothy.
Timothy. Thank you for the question. I mean, I think it's interesting you say, not local level, not just as an association. I guess you're talking about the Baptist Association. Obviously, PCI, its implications there. I do think there are institutional implications for it, and I know that within the Baptist Association, I think the work of what's he called? Colin Cooper, who's now very very much working to help at an association level, which I think is a very positive thing. As a local church, I think a lot of it's got to be in terms of expectations, probably. The guy's human, and I think expectations can be very unrealistic. When you call a pastor, you're thinking, I want a preacher who can preach like, Tim Keller or John Piper. You think of the best preacher that you've heard in a podcast, and you're looking for a preacher who can be like that. And you think, well, we need him to be pretty good at counselling as well. So, who's the best counsellor that we know? And you think of someone like, Paul Tripp's written some really, really good books. So we want the counselling wisdom of Paul Tripp. We want the preaching skills of John Piper. And you think, well, we need vision and organisation and so on. So you think about, some brilliant organisational leader, and then you think, Sir Alex Ferguson did a pretty good job at Man United, in that setup. So could we get somebody that's got all of those things? But we forget all of those people. Those are all different people. They're all, it takes 4 people to do all that. And sometimes I think we maybe have an expectation that all of that has to come together in one person. So the issue of expectations, I think, be prayerful for the pastor and his family. I think I would say as well, be supportive, be encouraging. I think also if you do have critique, be very careful how you frame it and when you frame it, because done in the wrong way at the wrong time, you could really destroy the person. Really knock him back. Is he in your church? You're glad he's asked that, right? I think there's that. I think there's particular responsibility for elders in that setting, who work with, and obviously in the Baptist setting and Presbyterian setting, the pastor/minister is a fellow elder. But I think there's a responsibility on elders to be shepherding the shepherd. And if you see that the guy is, he hasn't had a day off for 2 weeks, well, he needs to be doing something about that. Being realistic about the number of evenings that you expect the person to be there. A lot of it around that. I think the church generally, recognizing the humanity, being compassionate, but I think there's a particular responsibility for elders who see more closely perhaps what's going on and who are more aware of the burdens and the responsibilities of leadership. I think there's a responsibility then on elders to be saying, what do we need to do to help to shoulder this burden? What are your own thoughts?
That's what you wouldn't ask. Well, I think you could ask the same question next door. I think it'd be relevant in there too. Garth will tell you my answer in 20 minutes long.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's a really, really good question. Thank you. I think that whole thing of the relationship between, I hesitate slightly to use this, but leaders and followers, or pastors in the flock. There's a lot that could be said just about that dynamic and how they relate. And even in the secular world, in recent years, there's been more attention paid to followers. Because a leader without they say a leader without followers is just taking a walk. That's the test. But also, I think there's increasing recognition of the influence that followers can have on leaders, and I think leaders need to learn to hear voices. Sometimes voices that maybe don't always agree. Somebody, it's a secular leadership professor who's originally from Strabane, and now works in the south of England. He said that the most successful leaders tend to be those with the least compliant followers. Now, if that puzzles you, come talk to me afterwards. But I think there's truth in it. They've finished, so we need to stop as well. Thank you for being here, and I hope you.